So we started 2019, way back in January, with a question box service in which we collected questions from all of you during the service and brought them up here, and some of them I answered on the spot, and some of them we saved to talk about later. And I thought it would be fun for the summer to go back and preach on some of those unanswered questions. So that's what we've been doing in a couple of different sermons throughout the summer. Today is the last of these question box related sermons. And I thought today we would look at some of your more metaphysical questions. You wanted to know about God and soul and death and so on. I'm not even going to pretend that I can respond satisfactorily to all of these questions in one sermon. That is assuming that I could ever respond to them satisfactorily. These questions that humans have been wondering about for all of human history, right? They're huge questions. So my goal for today is just to have a little bit of fun and maybe jog our brains a little bit and expand our capacity to wonder and to question. So in true UU fashion, as I was pouring through these questions, you started off with a rather skeptical-minded question. The question was, what is the strongest evidence of a supernatural power? What is the strongest evidence of a supernatural power? Now, I don't know about the idea of supernatural versus natural. One could argue that if something exists, then it's part of nature by definition. It's natural. It may just be a nature that we can't understand yet or describe within our existing scientific laws. Now, I've said before that I'm an agnostic. 90% of the time, I'm happily ensconced within the scientific materialist understanding of the universe, which says that all that is matter and energy interacting according to the laws of physics that are pretty well understood. So instead of supernatural, let's say, what is the evidence for something that is so far outside the compass of that scientific understanding that that understanding has to be considered seriously incomplete? So for example, aliens would not count, right? I don't know if there are aliens. It makes sense to me that there would be aliens. It seems less likely that those aliens have contacted our planet. It seems even less likely that they're like stealing cows and snatching people out of their bedrooms. But even if they were, there's nothing supernatural about that, right? But something like ESP, okay, something like people seeing the future, something like telepathy, that would be supernatural in the sense that if it existed, it would mean that in some important sense, our scientific understanding of the universe was fundamentally wrong, right? There's some huge hole in our understanding. The strongest scientific evidence for ESP, by the way, this sermon is not ESP, but the strongest scientific evidence for ESP is probably the Gansfield experiments, which you can Google if you're interested. It's not great scientific evidence, but it's at least some scientific evidence. But anyway, this sermon isn't about ESP, so I thought we would start by looking at some strictly philosophical arguments that make me personally wonder if our scientific understanding of what's going on is seriously incomplete. So, this is my understanding of the scientific creation story of the universe. Once upon a time, the teeming vastness of our entire universe was all compressed together inside a wee dot of space-time. And about 14.7 billion years ago, give or take a few, for reasons unknown, that wee dot began expanding rapidly outward in a tremendous release of blazing energy, and then the energy settled down to form the fundamental forces and light and matter, and then that matter came together to form suns and planets. Some of those planets cooled down and developed stable atmospheres and climates. Then on at least one of those planets, single-celled organisms spontaneously self-organized, began to form copies of themselves. Then evolution took over, and a few billion years later, you have my dog Shadow, who is a good boy. That is the short version. I have omitted a few details. But it's a great story, and it has the benefit of being true in the scientific sense, which is to say it is really, really consistent with everything we know about how the universe works. But it begs the question, where did that wee dot come from to begin with? And here science has no answer. Science starts with the dot, right? So if you want to talk about incomplete, that is seriously incomplete. Now you can say that God made the dot, But that's not very helpful because it doesn't tell you anything about God other than that God is a dot-making thing. It doesn't explain where God came from, so you're right back wondering where did things come from. And this approach, by the way, of trying to prove that God exists by finding something that science can't currently explain and then saying, well, God must have done it, it's called the God of the gaps. It's not usually something that's considered a very strong argument for God, again, because it doesn't tell us anything. But to me, it is much more spiritually fruitful to remind myself of all the things that science can't explain, beginning with, why is there even anything to begin with at all? And that encourages me to be humble and open-minded. And this is how I try to live out our fourth UU principle, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, by remembering all of those tremendous gaps. Okay, so let's return to that dot, right? Let's look again at that wee dot as it exploded. In the first second of the birth of the universe, a lot of things got decided that shaped what our future universe would look like, right? The fundamental forces of the universe came to be. Gravity, electromagnetism, the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force. These forces have different characteristics, and these characteristics are incredibly important for determining what the universe looks like. For example, gravity is attractive, it only pulls stuff together, whereas electromagnetism both pushes and pulls. If it didn't, if electromagnetism only pulled, atoms would collapse in on themselves in an instant, and the universe would be a very, very boring place. Right? So if electromagnetism only repelled, atoms would fly apart. And again, the universe would be very boring. You need the push and the pull. So it may seem trivial to say that if the fundamental forces that make up the universe were different, the universe would be different. Right? That seems trivial. But the universe isn't just different. The universe is interesting. It's a universe where non-boring things happen, and happen all the time, like, for example, the evolution of life and the formation of planets and galaxies. So the question is, how much could you change those fundamental forces that just seem to have happened and still get an interesting universe? The kind of universe where there's not just something, but there's planets and there's puppies. So in 1993, a physicist named Paul Davies made the claim that, for example, if the strong nuclear force, the force that holds an atom together, were just 2% stronger than it is, then all the hydrogen in the universe would have burned up almost immediately, and you would never get the basic elements from which we get planets and ultimately life. Following on this idea, another physicist named Martin Rees wrote a book called Just Six Numbers, in which he argued that there is surprisingly little wiggle room in how you make an interesting universe. He identified just 6 fundamental ways in which, if our Big Bang had just been a tiny bit different, right, like a force had differed by just like 1,000th of a part, the universe would never have happened in any way that would be interesting to talk about, which some of you might consider a small mercy at this point in the presentation. So this problem of how precisely calibrated the basic forces of the universe have to be in order for anything at all interesting to exist is called the fine-tuning problem. And physicists take it seriously enough to argue with each other about it. Because why? Why would it be that of all of the possible values that these constants could land on, these fundamental universal constants, they land on just exactly, precisely the constants needed to make life possible? Why do we live in this Goldilocks universe that is just so? Now, one argument called the strong anthropic principle says it's inherent in the universe to make itself in such a way that there could be life, but why that is not very clear. Some physicists argue that there's a multiverse, like universes are popping in and out of existence all the time, and most of them are like great howling voids of empty meaninglessness, but occasionally an interesting one happens. And obviously we live in one of those, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. But theistically minded scientists argue that this is evidence for a God, or some unknown creative force outside of the universe that intended the universe to be something interesting. and that had some intentional role in shaping how the math works in all of these fundamental forces. So, in terms of evidence, it's not exactly evidence, but the fine-tuning argument is one of those arguments that at least makes me go, Okay, now let's look at me standing here, and Because in wondering about the origin of the universe, I am confronted with the most surprising thing of all about the universe, which is that the universe, or at least some small human-shaped pieces of it, can wonder, can be a wondering thing. The universe woke up to itself. Consciousness is something that our scientific laws can't explain at all. And to me, this is the greatest mystery of all, bar none. If you assume that I am just like a whirling construct of matter and energy, then I am basically something like a fantastically complicated robot made out of meat, designed and activated by billions of years of evolution. Fair enough. I believe in evolution and I believe in robots. So I'm with you so far. And I believe that robots can perceive things in the world and respond to the world because I've seen Google self-driving cars going around perceiving the world and making decisions, right? Now, given current technology, I am happiest perceiving them at a distance, but I've seen them. So granted that they can process data and they can make decisions, though, are these robots experiencing the data that they're processing? And will they ever experience the world in the same way that I experience something as simple as eating a peach, as something that I'm aware of, as something that happens inside of me? Now, scientifically, if I'm just a robot myself, then the answer has to be yes. Right? Someday there will be robots that wake up and have experiences. But science is so far from being able to explain how a robot could ever become conscious that we don't even have the language to talk about it. We don't even have the language to wonder how that could be. So is consciousness supernatural? Well, no. I mean, what could be more natural? But it does make me wonder if our understanding of the universe is seriously, seriously incomplete. And if there's one question I wish I could understand before I die, it would be this one. How on earth is it possible that atoms come to wake up and have experiences? I don't think I will get an answer before I die, which makes me sad. If you have an answer, please share it. And if there's an answer waiting for me on the other side of death, that would be greatly appreciated, if anyone is listening. Okay, so if we can't explain how bodies become conscious, it raises the question of, can we have consciousness without bodies? Are there other kinds of consciousness? Are there consciousnesses without a body, something that we would ordinarily call a spirit? And one of the questions that you had for me is, are there spirits? No. My default answer is no. Seems pretty well scientifically established to me that consciousness is a product of a functioning nervous system housed in a functioning body. But since I've already admitted that we don't understand how that could possibly happen to begin with, it seems like an arrogant thing for me to say to just rule that out. So here, to the question of, is there some evidence of spirits, some kind of consciousness of a form that we don't understand, I would say there's not a lot of scientific evidence, but there is a lot of testimony. A lot of testimony. So as Unitarian Universalists, we say one of our sources of our religious tradition is the direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder. You can look it up in the Gray Hymnal. One of our sources is the direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder, for which some people use the word God or spirit. As human beings, whatever our theology, we all have experiences of reverence, of awe, of longing, right? We all experience at times a love that is so strong and so tender it is almost painful. The beauty of the world can break into us in surprising and intimate ways, like a storm in our hearts, in our being. So in our reading today, the poet Czesław Miłosz, he hears the voices of angels, he says, in a melody repeated by a bird, or in the smell of apples at close of day when the light makes the orchard's magic. He says, the voice, weightless and winged, girdled with lightning, I have heard that voice many a time. Some would say those experiences, that lightning voice inside of us, those experiences point to God, to a larger spirit of loving kindness that is at work in the world. For some people, this is an object of faith. It's an object of hope. For other people, it just makes sense. It explains the universe better than anything else that names their experience. For many people, experience the spirit of love as a very real presence in their hearts. And some people experience the spirit of love in a very immediate way, as an experience of a living presence. And that includes some UU ministers. For example, the Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt tells this story, which I've shared with you before. She says, "One day, God spoke. On retreat at a women's conference in Wisconsin, I joined with other participants in a sacred spiral dance led by a noted member of the women's spirituality movement. Asked," she says, "as part of the dance to speak to the divine and listen for an answer, I joined in, impatient, skeptical, and freezing cold. And she says, I made a perfunctory list of my concerns, and suddenly I could feel a presence in me. It was a presence that made itself felt in every cell of my body, and it was followed by a voice, neither male nor female, utterly unlike anything I had ever felt. The voice made itself heard in my body, and it told me clearly, lovingly, don't worry, my child, don't worry. When I spoke to the voice about the hopes and dreams of my heart, it promised me all these things and more." And then she says, "The voice and the presence left me changed forever." So these kinds of mystical experiences, this direct experience of a living presence, these are actually not that uncommon. I mean, not everyone has them. I've never had one. But people report them all the time, from the Catholic monk Thomas Merton to the atheist biologist Barbara Ehrenreich to maybe a half dozen UU ministers that I can think of off the top of my head. This is part of the data of human religious experience. It is natural to have these kinds of experiences. I don't know what to do with this information, but I don't dismiss it either, because it's a very human experience. One trait that is consistent with mystical experiences like this is what psychologist William James called their noetic quality. This means that people who have these encounters with a living presence like this, they find them to be powerfully meaningful. Even if they can't say exactly what happened to them, they know that something profound happened to them, and their lives are changed. Barbara Ehrenreich described it as, "The world flamed into life, something poured into me, and I poured out into it." Mystical experiences change the course of people's lives. And again, these are natural experiences, but they raise the question of whether our scientific understanding of what natural means is seriously incomplete. So if we can't explain how bodies produce consciousness, and we can't rule out the possibility that there are consciousnesses without bodies, it raises the final question of whether our consciousness could exist outside of a body. And 3 of the questions you asked me back in January had to do with this idea. Is death the end, you asked? Does the soul live forever? Does Unitarian Universalism believe that life continues after death? So the last question is the easy part. I would say there's no particular Unitarian Universalist opinion as to whether or how or in what way we live on after death, right? Beliefs go all across the spectrum among Unitarian Universalists. Many UUs find comfort in the idea that death is a returning to the source of life, and we live on inside the cycles of life's endless creativity. There's a poem that speaks to this belief by Anne Alexander Bingham called "It Is Enough." It is enough. It is enough to know that the atoms of my body will remain, to think of them rising through the roots of a great oak, to live in leaves, branches, twigs, perhaps to feed the crimson peony, the blue iris, the broccoli, or rest on water, freeze and thaw with the seasons. Some of my atoms, she says, might become a bit of fluff on the wing of a chickadee, to feel the breeze and know the support of air. And some might drift up and up into space, stardust returning from whence it came. It is enough to know, she says, that as long as there is a universe, I am a part of it. So that's one understanding of in what sense we might live on after we die. But there are many other thoughts about what might happen after we die. There is reincarnation, right? The idea that our spirit returns to the source of all spirit and then is eventually reborn in a human body. There's not a lot of scientific evidence for this, but again, there's some evidence. But there's certainly testimony. There's certainly testimony, and I think that many people experience this evidence in the form of what I will call spooky toddler syndrome, or STS. This is when your toddler walks into the bedroom at like 3 in the morning and says like, Daddy, I miss my blanket that I had before I died and became your baby. And you're like, huh. And then they explain the blanket in great detail. And then maybe they talk about the person who made it. And on and on and on, right? Perhaps you've had your own experience of spooky toddler syndrome. If you go online, you can Google kids' past life memories and find like a bajillion examples of people sharing their experiences of spooky toddler syndrome. And one of the more famous recent examples is that of James Leininger, who supposedly at age 2 began recounting vivid memories of being a World War II pilot, being shot down, being named the aircraft carrier that he was on, sort of. He named a lot of other surprising details. Some people find this story very compelling. Some people think it's been somewhat debunked. These stories could be evidence of reincarnation. They could point to a collective unconscious or a human collective memory, or they could be coincidence and confirmation bias, right? But I think that it is fair to say that there is so much experience of spooky toddler syndrome in the world that people will always be wondering. And following in this vein, I will also say, again, just from the realm of experience and testimony, that it is common to experience unexplainable things around death and dying. It is common. People who are dying often have visions. They see visitors. They speak to people that only they can see. And oftentimes these are departed relatives or loved ones who are reassuring them, who are welcoming them home. Often someone will remain on the verge of death for a very long time until they see a person who says, it's okay, we're waiting for you, come home. And then that person passes away, right? This is really common. And on the other side of that, people who are around dying people often have experiences that they can't explain. They see flashes of light, they feel warmth, they feel physical sensations like something passing through their bodies at the time of death. People often have the experience of knowing from afar exactly the moment when a loved one dies, or of even being visited by that loved one in some visible way at the time of death, as a feeling or a vision or a voice. So there are a myriad of physical or logical explanations for how these experiences might come to be, right? They can be explained away. But for the people who have these experiences, those explanations are often not a very convincing match for what they have experienced, which is to say, death is mysterious, and mysterious things happen in its wake. And as one of you admonished me when you asked this question, is death the end? If you think you know, your ego is too strong. So all these questions about God and the universe, about mind and spirit, about the great mystery of death and whatever lies beyond, they remind me to be humble and to be curious. That whatever beliefs I have need to have a big asterisk beside them that acknowledges that reality might be fundamentally different from anything I can even imagine. And this opens me up to wonder, and wonder brings me to gratitude. To gratitude, what a delight to be part of something so vast, so mysterious, so omnipresent, and yet so hidden as life and all of its questions. So in that spirit, I'd like to close today with the words of the Reverend Ken Patton, who said, "Let us worship with our eyes and ears and fingertips. Let us love the world through heart and mind and body. We feed our eyes upon the mystery and the revelation in the faces of our family, our friends, our neighbor. Let us worship not in bowing down, not with closed eyes and stopped ears, but with the opening of all the window of our being, with the full outstretching of our spirits. Life, he says, comes with singing and laughter, with tears and confiding, with a rising wave too great to be held in the mind and heart and body to those who have fallen in love with life. Let us worship, let us wonder, and let us learn to love. Blessed be. Amen.